Each new disruptor mandates, if only as a side effect, the death of one incarnation of the company and the birth of a new one. For innovators operating under conditions of big bang disruption, surviving success is nearly as hard as surviving failure. They're the words from our guest and this stellar series that we're conducting with the author of Big Bang Disruption, Paul Nunes. Welcome back.
Thanks, Aidan. Great to be back.
We have Paul straight back from his holidays as well, straight into the hot seat here as well. So he's nice and fresh. And I thought, Paul, we'd describe some of the laws that you introduced in the book. So, some people know these. We've talked about Moore's Law before. But I thought it was also important to introduce the other law, which is Moore's Law backwards, which was Eroom's Law, because this is important when it comes to some of the later rules. Today, we're going to talk about the 4 phases of the redistributed landscape of Everett Rogers' old bell curve to Paul's new curve, the shark fin. And then we're going to talk about the 12 rules that fall under those. A lot to get through. But Paul, let's start with Eroom's Law.
Yeah, well, Eroom's Law is an interesting thing that we found, and I'm not sure a lot of people actually use the term outside of, pharmaceuticals, where it was first really understood. Which is this idea that while Moore's Law is reducing the cost, increasing the power of everything, it turns out that in pharmaceutical, the success of new drugs, the creation and the amount spent has actually been the reverse of Moore's Law. And we've actually seen logarithmically, which means, in a 10x kind of change, the number of drugs discovered and the number of billions of dollars spent to discover them has actually been declining dramatically. So whereas $1 billion might have gotten you, 100 new drugs 20, 30 years ago, today, you spend $20 billion to get maybe one new drug. And so this reverse and everything, it's better to understand, we always talk about how to understand trends and the importance of these mega trends that underlie things. That's been an enormous law in pharmaceuticals, and one that's really scared people because it said, well, do you have to be a huge company with billions of dollars to invest to actually make something happen? And, this idea of the blockbuster drug, it's an enormous risk to put out $5-10 billion in drug development with only a few likely winners.
So, Paul, one of the reasons I mentioned that was it's important for those legacy or incumbent industries rather than companies. Those companies, like, say, for example, in the banking, that are heavily regulated, because there's a quote there that I wanted to pull, and this talks later on. So we might talk about USPS, the United States Postal Service, later on, and their tragic demise, if we want to call it that, because you wrote, executives who rely on regulatory costs as barriers to more efficient forms of research and development are lulling themselves into a dangerous slumber. In healthcare, like you just mentioned, finance, energy, and other heavily regulated industries, consumer pressure for big bang disruption is building to dangerous levels. I thought about that image of the Dutch boy with the dam, with his finger in the dam.
Exactly.
Many industries are relying on regulation, and we see it particularly with banking.
You see it in banking, but you see it in pharmaceuticals as well. I think what's interesting, pulling from recent experience, is vaccines for COVID and such, and other vaccines, and that the amount of testing and government regulation and the amount of proof. Now, all of that's very well and good. You want to have safe drugs in that, unless you're in a big hurry because you've got a pandemic, a global pandemic. There's an interesting sort of trade-off between the ability to be creative and innovative quickly and the need for that, and then also the need and the maturing of industries, and like you say, banking, where we also want to have regulation safety. I mean, you look at cryptocurrency is another, is an example of, well, this is what happens when we don't have the kind of regulation and oversight that we traditionally have. But we'll talk about a little more as we go through some of the details of the shark fin. But whether it be Airbnb or Uber, and those are just examples of those kinds of businesses, online home rental, P2P, peer-to-peer home rental, or essentially Lyft services, car services like Lyft and Uber, pressing at the very edge of what's legal. And like you say, sort of the Dutch boy with the finger in the dam, it's like, well, once the technology and the possibilities become so much greater than the reality, that's where you get a big bang. And for incumbents, it's really important to figure out, well, to what extent am I going to try and hold the dam back, keep the dam there, hold the water back, and at what point am I going to release it? And we've got a great example coming up. I'll talk about in terms of Philips and incandescent lighting. But this idea of, do you try and hold the water back? And I think it's interesting because I think we saw even in writing the book that the more water you hold back and the longer you do it, the more pressure builds and the more catastrophic the rush is when dam fails.
And it's like you're the source of this, by the way. I have to say this: the quote that we hear a lot in innovation, Ernest Hemingway, "The sun always rises." I'll let you quote it coming from the source himself because you're a highly eclectic reader. So you read widely, you read from many, many different areas, and this is so common in innovation where we see the gradual and then the sudden demise.
Yeah, well, it's really almost just a throwaway, even in the book. He's having drinks in Spain, the protagonist, and with another sort of, lost generation person, a rich or formerly rich person that lost it in the Depression. So they're all in Europe. And so he's just talking about a time he's having a conversation, the protagonist having a conversation in a cafe, and he asks this rich guy, how his family business went bankrupt. So, and he says, well, gradually at first, then suddenly. um, and it kind of really summarized a lot of, for us, Big Bang disruption victims. And it's like, well, whether it's Blockbuster as the classic example or Nokia or other ones, right? But it always seems like they're always, and it's important to think about, they're always kind of going bankrupt gradually before suddenly. And one of the things that, yeah, I'll just throw in that Kodak, it was interesting. I was just looking at some of the old pictures of Kodak there in the book, and you see that the number of employees had dropped off pretty enormously, pretty catastrophically, well before the business performance dropped off. And so for anybody who was looking at it, you say, well, all right, the stock price is kind of doing fine. But what's happening with half of the employee population?
And it's true that, as you identify as well, it's usually the good ones who leave first because they're the ones who are, like you recognize in your first book, Jumping the S Curve, or your first in this series, is that they're the ones who are highly talented and will look for growth elsewhere.
It's interesting. That's both true of talent. So you want to watch where your talent is going. So even in pinball, it was really interesting. Most of the home electronics games were designed by pinball designers because really there wasn't a huge industry of entertainment and electronic entertainment designers. Where were you going to find those people? Well, those people were, and we did all the research, and those people existed and were poached from the pinball industry. And so, when you start to see some of your employees packing up and moving on, it's like, well, everybody's got different life things. But when you start to see them moving, like at, Fairchild Semiconductor, you see them moving over and en masse to something new and different. You might want to pay attention.
That's a good time to move your investment as well into an early pre-IPO, perhaps, investment as well. It's an interesting way to track the talent rather than the stock price. It's a good way to think about this.
Yeah, it all comes together because what's really interesting, we found the two things. Like I said, one is it's often the same people that build an industry, not just a company. So, Gordon Moore worked with all the folks at Intel and such, all worked in Fairchild Semiconductor and stuff at first early on and kind of cut their teeth there and moved on. The second thing we found in the first book in Jumping the S Curve that's important is this idea of being a hothouse of talent and growing and throwing off talent into the industry. And so when you see and follow where those people are going, you start to see where industry trends are. And I'll just throw in one more thing because I think it's an important idea that I'm not sure has come out. I know I mentioned it earlier, but I think it's really important is that, you know, a person's job or employment is one of the most important critical decisions and investments they make in your whole life. And so the value and the promise that's inherent in that, right? So looking for good talent and smart people and seeing where are smart people placing their bets, because it's one thing for people to place money, but when you place your time, your life, when you're betting your life on something, you're pretty convinced. And when you start to see talent flowing out in the same way, when good talent loses confidence, that's time to pay attention.
Great call out, man. Great call out. I love that. And you've teed us up beautifully for a case study I've never heard. And I have to say, I've read some of these case studies, and I've said to Paul, I've written about them in my own book. And Paul was the source of those. So Paul was the original person to write about Fujifilm, for example, well ahead of many other people in the industry as well. But one of the great, great case studies you cover is, like you said, the pinball industry, because it was an industry. It was huge for a very, very long time. And it also is a lovely way to tee us up for the shark fin.
Yeah, so let's talk about the shark fin and its phases. But if you talk about pinball, what is really emblematic in it is how innovation was seen and underrated. Innovation relied, as it always kind of does, on the existing industry for a time, and then it moves off. And then I think one of the really interesting things is the commitment of the industry, and even in pinball, which was billions of dollars. Pinball was once um, almost the equal of movie theater revenues. It's crazy to think about. That's how big, in the U.S. at least, pinball as an industry became. And so it's hard for those folks to sort of see the need to move to the next industry, particularly when the next industry is going to be 10x or 100x larger than what they have. And even at the very end, many of the founders and successful folks in pinball stuck with it. And one of the things I was just, renewing my awareness of was just how dedicated those who were committed to the industry. They started making pinball software for these machines because darn it, they weren't going to give up on pinball. And so, one of the big leaders of pinball and Bally and whatever, but one of the big founders of it, went all the way through with it to video. And some of us are old enough to remember pinball on video machines, but it was like, but I just can't let it go. So I think that's really interesting. I think what's interesting is how different the life cycle, it kind of highlights the change and the shift in the life cycle of a product that occurs on a shark fin instead of a bell curve. So we talked about Everett Rogers' bell curve and the different segments of customers. But it's very different when you have this shark fin shape. And so what we recognize, there were really four areas of business activity, we call them sort of four stages in the new life cycle that companies really have to think about and reinvent for and get their arms around. And so there's what we call the singularity, but it's this coming together, like when the bang happens. So sort of borrowing from the idea of a big bang, the event, which is really the innovation phase. Then there's the second phase, which is the um, the rapid scaling or in, what we call catastrophic success, which is this idea of all of the demand comes immediately. Then there's the post saturation downturn, which is also much faster than the traditional bell curve. And then there's this flat sort of entropy stage, which is what do we do now? And I think the thing to do is probably look at each of those stages in itself and see how business strategy has to change.
Before we go through today's session, so what we'll do today is go through each of those 4 phases, but also then there's 3 rules that fall out of each of those phases. So you can be leading the industry and avoid this big bang disruption yourself. But a great case study, again, that I think you so clearly wrote about with Larry in this book is Nintendo. And the fact that the disruption cycles are coming so quickly that you almost, as soon as you develop a product, you're moved on to the next one, or else you've actually planned out a sequence of products because, as you say in the book, because of near perfect market information, your customers are going to be the ones pushing those innovations upon you. So you don't have time to dwell and enjoy your success. Simply no time anymore. And then at the same time, as you say, you have to prepare for what happens if immediate success comes. And the Nintendo story tells a lot about this.
Yeah, and the Nintendo story is really best summarized in a chart that I hope and think we can probably project for viewers. Yeah, because and listeners, but for listeners, it's really you just imagine this bell curve shape, and over time, with different product introductions, the shape of the distribution of the sales of that starts to change from a bell curve. So it happened gradually in many ways for Nintendo. Nintendo's first products actually, the sales of them follow a bell curve, but gradually it starts to shift. And you see towards the very end, the newest products are very much a shark fin curve of adoption, all the way up into the Wii systems. Um, and then you also see like Wii U, which didn't do very well. So you kind of see exactly the bump we talk about in the innovation cycle, which is where if it's not going to sell, if it's not to the customer satisfaction, it's not going to take off. It's not going to have even a bell curve rise. It's going to go up pretty quickly, like Wii U did, and drop fairly quickly as well. So we really see in this one company that's been selling, excellent and successful product, an excellent and successful product over time, exactly how the shape of sales changes, including this little dip that we call the saddle, which is interesting because the bell curve is never entirely a bell curve. What happens at the top of a bell curve is competitors come in and prices start to reduce. So what happens is you then lower your prices to compete, sales comes back, you get a second bump, and it's sort of what they call in finance, a dead cat bounce. And it's really important for those who kind of study these curves to recognize that. It's like, no, when you get that second sales lift at the end of the bell curve because you've cut prices and people would rather have your brand than the competing brand, but you're losing revenue, that's kind of the sign that, okay, that's the dead cat bounce. This means that sales lift means, yeah, it's the end is coming. And so Nintendo's a fantastic example on a ton of levels because it really highlights, the all the parts of the shark fin, which is the amount of technology insight you have to bring and timing, just like we talked about in the Kindle of that, in terms of the innovation cycle. And particularly in a business that, as you see this happening, so what happens is in the shark fin is many times you're out of the market longer than you're in the market. And I like that expression, so I'll say it again: out of the market longer than you're in the market. Because the time it takes you to develop the product and the winning formula might be years or decades. A decade literally. Amazon actually, Bezos pointed out that he was 7 years before the Kindle was introduced. And remember, they never introduced test product. But he had started thinking about and doing real research and acting on it 7 years before the Kindle was introduced. That's a long time to be out of the market before you're in the market. And then once it started selling, by the time the next version, and this gets to the question of versioning, the importance of, once you have this, you're going to have this rapid adoption that we talked about because people want the best. And when you're the best on every strategic dimension, you're the it product. But then what happens is you saturate the market very quickly. And so, if I have 300 million people, just to say in the United States, selling more than 300 million Nintendos is going to be a trick because, even if everybody bought one, everybody has a need for one, but very few people have a need for two, right? Maybe in the guest house or, whatever. But you can see there are physical limits to saturation. And so what we found that was really interesting is where so often in the past, most companies don't plan for saturation, really. I kind of mentioned it in a previous call a little bit about cruise ships and that, how many rooms do you need in cruise ships? How many available across all providers for, people? It's like, well, for a population, it's like, well, I don't know, but I know it's a lot fewer than we have right now. So I'm not going to worry about it. But that's very different than, say, phones or iPods or lots of these other products, where we actually can talk about saturation pretty darn quickly.
And one of the examples you give later on in the book to tie it to the Kindle is the Barnes and Noble Nuke and how they had overplanned because they had early success, and then they lost billions because they had overinvested.
Yeah, I'm glad you bring that up, Aidan, because one of the other things I like to say, I don't think I ever said it specifically in the book, or we ever said it specifically in the book, but I love using it in talks where I present on this, is there's no business so good that it can't be destroyed by messing up inventory. And all the supply chain folks that I've presented to, they just love it. They kind of, yeah, it's great. But it's so true when you think about it. And this is what Big Bang disruption brings to this, is that you don't know how many of something you're going to have to make to optimize sales, right? The right amount. They always kind of joke and say, the right amount of anything to make that you're selling is market demand minus one. When you're going to see, even if you know ahead of time, there's going to be saturation and there's going to be what we term, this potentially catastrophic success. You can't use the old rules of how to guess how many you're going to need. And it really, in some ways, becomes a guess. And it becomes a function of, how much stomach you have for the risk. And so we're jumping ahead a little bit to this phase of catastrophic success, but let's stay on that, for another moment, because there's really interesting things there with this, like how do you bet on this? And, one of the things that was really interesting that we saw was even a company like Microsoft. Microsoft had to, add to its books a minus $1 billion. I was asked people and, close to 10, well, what was that? How did Microsoft lose $1 billion one quarter? And the answer was a little thing called the Surface tablet. And if you remember back, a while back, and some may or may not remember, but after the iPad was sort of introduced in that, and the whole tablet thing became important, Microsoft entered the tablet market with the Surface tablet. Well, it turned out that it had a lot of these, and a lot of these were in inventory. And it turns out that finally the accountants caught up with them and said, you got these marked, you got these booked at $1,000 a piece, but I don't think you're going to get $1,000. You might not even get 500. I think you got to make an adjustment here. And Microsoft, to his credit, said, you're probably right. So boom, they wrote down $1 billion in inventory value on existing Surface tablets that they knew they weren't going to be able to sell. Now, at the time, of course, it was critically important, as it always is, to keep inventory on the shelf. The last thing you want is stockouts, right? Stockouts can be an okay thing for a very short period of time if it makes people feel like, demand is high and, there can be strategic shortages. But if you're really going to optimize the value, that strategic shortage can't last very long. So, you underproduce and you lose the opportunity, you overproduce and you lose, you overproduce and you wind up eating all your profits off of the fact that you've got all this other inventory that's got to be sold. Nothing. Now, I'll give you another good example that's really interesting, because the other problem can be that the competitor, when you've made a choice of what to build, can actually come from another direction. This is where the iPad comes in again. The iPad, there was a drawing company that was built to work off of the Wii, and it was a standalone pad so that you could use Wii to draw stuff. Well, it turned out that they built the whole product, and they built millions of units for sale right at the time the iPad was becoming really popular. And it turned out that nobody really wanted to buy both an iPad and a UDraw. And so, the guys are like, we did everything right, and we had this great product that was going to, again, be a multi-million seller on the back of, the hugely successful Nintendo product, and all the market research is everything fine. But again, going to what happens when you have a powerful platform in the marketplace, the speed at which a competitor can come in and override your product is mind blowing.
This point of supply chain, I know you said it, and all the supply chain guys love you. It's so, so important. And supply chain to me was something so, so boring before I delved deeply into innovation. And before I read the book, The Magic Conveyor Belt by Professor Yossi Sheffi, who's a future guest. He's our next series, by the way, on the Innovation Show. But also, Yossi and Paul are going to come together and do an intersections show where we both talk about supply chain from an innovation perspective, because there's so much in this. And it got my mind shooting in so many directions just to bring it to life for some of our audience who maybe work in marketing. I worked as head of digital for a media company, Paul, and where I first experienced this idea of devastating success was we were first to do a few innovations. Like, for example, we live streamed the Irish budget on our homepage, and we had like a Twitter poll and places you could ask questions, all this kind of stuff. But we weren't prepared for the amount of traffic that we got. And the website goes down, right? So, and luckily we had Amazon Web Service, so we were able to, and in its early days, we were able to scale to actually evolve to the size of the audience. But we missed so much of our audience. So we learned quickly. But that was where I discovered this. But one of the examples you give from the book that people might not know of because they know of the success story is Dollar Shave Club.
Yeah, Dollar Shave Club is another great one that builds off of the potential of recombinant innovation, where we have all these different availabilities of the parts that we talked about, and where, so long as you've got some of this, internet connectivity, you can bring together marketing and outsourced product development and creation and production, and you can basically outsource every piece of the puzzle, and try and manage this demand. The key is the risk in terms of having available product. And see, in the old days, which is important for those who maybe haven't even seen it from their own professional careers, but in the old days when you had a bell curve, you could actually, the way that you tested things, you would market test, you'd put it out there, you'd see how fast it was getting adopted, and then you would call that the beginning of an S curve, and then you would show the shape. It was called a Bass diffusion model. And then you'd have a pretty good sense of where it was going to end up based on how fast it was getting adopted early on. And then you could build more. And the idea was also that, you had months before that demand was going to show up, and you just had to make sure you had enough in the warehouse. And you tried to manage warehouse costs and this and that. But obviously, as the S curves got shorter and more vertically, became more vertical, the time in warehouse to the time to market, so having to stockpile for initial demand so that you would have at least some product in the market became much more critical. And so it became an enormous risk. And that's where you see that large incumbents have a much better ability to handle that risk. So when Microsoft lost $1 billion. It didn't destroy the company. They just lost $1 billion in inventory. Well, there's not a lot of companies that can support a loss of $1 billion in inventory just because they didn't guess demand right. So we see that for smaller companies, there's obviously much more of a bias to under production versus overproduction. But again, it can happen on both sides of the coin, as I pointed out, where something happens and you were sure that you had the sale, you were sure you were going to be the it product, and the market moved on.
Before we move on to, so we're we're already starting into it here, and I'm jumped ahead, Paul. You're kind of stimulating my nerve endings here all over the place, neurons going left, right, and center. But there's a really powerful insight in Nintendo's succession of shark fins. We showed that curve a second ago. What you say here is notice that the apparent cannibalization of sales from one generation to the next does not actually begin when the replacement product is released. That dramatic decline in sales for each product, its big crunch, begins a year or two before the next product was launched. That's a really important point.
Or yeah, and oftentimes in some ways the day it's announced or the day it's released. Because here's the thing that happens is we've trained customers. And more, customers have become aware, and we've actually trained them to expect versioning, because customers know about Moore's law. I mean, in the old days, it was just some geeks in the back, right, that kind of knew about Moore's law, and there was business people in those industries, right? Today, you probably can't find a person on the, 50% of the street. People in all kinds of industries understand the concept of Moore's law. But more importantly, they understand the concept of deflation in technology products. They understand that the television that was $1,000 last month, or last year, is $500 this year, and now it was $1,000 last month. It's going to be $800, $600. So the idea of the deflationary power of technology is understood by consumers, and they also understand that in time, they're catching on to this. In time, the next version is going to be better and cheaper. Kind of has to be, because I know these companies are working hard to make the product better, and I know that technology deflation is going to make it cheaper. So you think of your iPhone, for example, right? And you say, I can't put the customer on hold, make them wait a year for an iPhone, or for an if there aren't enough of them, without having to either lower the price or up the value, because customers expect that this cadence, the cadence of technology improvement. And you think about it in anything, right? Even cars. It's like, well, one of the things I was realizing is the only way to tell a 10-year-old car from today's car, one of the only ways to tell today's car is how big the screen is. And really, in short, right? You can't see anything on the outside, generally maybe the bit of the LED headlights. But the fastest way to tell how new a car is how big the screen is on the dashboard. But customers come to expect that, and they realize, like, well, next year the dashboard might be twice as big, the screen. So maybe I'll just wait for that. And so you get into this setup where you have to introduce a set of value at a price point, and then with the expectation that 12 months later or 24 months later or whatever it is, you're going to come out with the next version. It's going to be better and cheaper, and that's why we version through iPhones. But that's where the real challenge in innovation can become, is that not only do you have to win on the first product and the market saturation, but you've got to create enough innovation to overwhelm the lower cost, because otherwise you wind up in Clay Christensen's problem, in the innovator's dilemma. Because now what happens is I don't have enough innovation to keep people buying, my thing or more or better. So yeah, now you are going to have a problem with the cheaper and not as good, or cheaper and as good. And if you think about all the different phone makers, and so there were a bunch of Chinese ones that we talked to, and that great ones that use the power of open sourcing, across the internet to create and sell cell phones, some with nice wooden cases and all these sort of things. But this ability, like where the next round of innovation is going to come, and how you're going to beat that versioning problem. And it's especially true, and this is interesting, in expensive products, right? Because the point is, I don't really want to buy $1,000 computer every year, or $1,000, $1,200 phone every year, unless I have a lot of new value to show for it. One of the great ones we looked at was the medical equipment industry, because when you think of something like a CAT scan or an MRI machine, well, these are multi-million-dollar investments. So I need to know, all right, this one's probably pretty good, and you're selling me this one, but given that I'm probably going to have to make this last for 5 years or more, whatever it is, before I can pay off the loan, how do I, as I amortize, how do I know what the next version is going to be? And so you see all these new things that companies have to do is, I know not only have to sell you this product, I have to give you some insight of what the next versions are going to look like in certain industries, right? I really have to tell you this shark fin cycle for the next 10 years, which is really hard to do, but it's a really interesting phenomenon. And I got to tell you, what am I going to do with, and we talked about this a little bit before, but what am I going to do with this MRI machine? How am I going to get it out of the building, let alone where is it going to? Is it going to another country? Is it going to, a smaller hospital in a more rural area? But, these are all things that companies never really had to plan for. Historically, 20 years ago, companies never really had to plan for the end of life cycle in a couple of years versus 10, 20 years.
And there's so much of that today. Like one of the challenges for me, you take an MRI machine, it actually pushes the company to then rethink the business model, that maybe leasing is a better model, but then what do I do with the excess machine? And even on a personal level, like I don't mind updating technology, but what I do mind is having this graveyard of old, like I'm pointing over there to the box that they're in, old iPads, old Macs, old phones that just have no use anymore. And they're just sitting there. And also, it's very hard to recycle them. Nobody wants them anymore because they're useless. Like I say this, my wife has one of those iRobots, Paul. She loves the thing, loves it much more than me. Runs the house. It's always cleaning, right? And she wanted to get a new one recently. No, she didn't. She actually goes, it's fine. And I'm going, get a new one. The new version is like 4 life cycles more improved. And see, she doesn't understand Moore's law. And I was like, it will be vastly superior. Doublings every time on each new generation. It's worth the investment.
Well, this is the challenge, right? Is how on earth does, and I'm intrigued by your logic on this, Aidan, I have to admit, because how does a room sweeper become 4 times better?
Well, actually, what happens in the room sweeper?
I mean, I understand the technology, like it gets the corners better with a better corner sweeper. It gets like 4. I don't know how many crumbs you've got in your you've got today.
Well, it'll actually discern what's trash, so it'll actually pick me out and hoover me up and actually dump me into
exactly.
You'll program that.
No, but that's the like it getting better, and this. But that's the trade-off that people make, and everything from sensitivities about throwing stuff in landfill to where's the back end of it. Where's the resale value, if there is any? And so that's actually something that I had mentioned it to you at one time, that it was actually one of the first things that I had studied and recognized about innovation was the nature of resale markets and how important they were going to become. And that's back 1990s. In mid 1990s, we realized that we're really going to have a problem where if we have all this innovation, thanks to Moore's law and everything else, we're going to have an awful lot of stuff that we've sold into people's homes that they don't need. They don't obviously need better for, and aren't going to have anything way to handle or do with it and get rid of. So this is a tremendous, tremendously important part of the saturation problem, which is that you may find the market is far more saturated than you think, and it does. GoPro is a great example, I think, of that, which is, how good a new GoPro do you need? And this question of, and the challenge of, if your GoPro, which are the cameras, most people are familiar with it, but the thing is that, well, once I have one, and then once I go to one that's 1080, instead of 720, so the resolution gets better. You get a bunch of, sort of obvious directions where the technology is going to get better. But at the end of the day, it's still kind of a camera you attach to yourself, a small. And if I've got one and I've spent a few $100 on it or more, am I in for the next $500 because it's that much better? And I'll let the other one sit around on the shelf, like you say.
A recent example, I'm going to call them out. The company, I don't know how you pronounce it, it's Miele or Miele, who create appliances like washing machines, right? So expensive, high end washing machines, like for doing your clothes. So we had one of these. We have 2 young kids, so we go through a lot of washing, right? And the machine breaks down after 2 years, right? And I'm like, why? This becomes a question then. Why invest like a grand in the machine, 1K, when I can actually buy a cheaper machine like a Hoover for €400 and actually replace it more often? And the dilemma doesn't become actually it's a newer machine and it will perhaps it has planned obsolescence, but actually it's an environmental and a sustainability question, because most of us, if we're very honest with ourselves, lean towards the toilet bowl problem, which is like, I'll flush it away and I don't see where it goes once I drop it to a landfill. But that is a problem. And that's my tug of war that happens inside me in those moments.
And I think it goes all over the place. And I think one of the places you see it that I find somewhat amusing, having studied the company for so long and seeing it as a pillar of success, is IKEA, right? Think of how many years we lionized a company that created disposable furniture. The stuff that you're supposed to throw out. Say, and then all of a sudden sustainability hits, and it's like, well, wait a minute. Maybe I should have grandma's sofa for 30 years because maybe it's not as good looking, but it's there, it's made, it's green. So I think this is an enormous question and challenge that companies have to face. And I think it also has to do when they're thinking in design of, you get 2 challenges. One is the differing paces of technology improvement. So the challenge you have with cars, and the same thing with some of these others, is that you're not able to switch out the components that are improving technologically at the same pace, at a much faster pace than the rest of the thing. So going back to the television we talked about, televisions used to be sold as furniture, in wooden boxes, that because you were going to keep that television, the Zenith television had nice wooden cabinetry. It was not the disposable thing that televisions are today. But you see that in all kinds of things, like you say, in cars and even in high-tech white goods, where the electronics. So why can't I swap out the electronics, or more importantly, swap out the belts and the whatever? So I think we're going to see an evolution to that, but it is difficult not to want to embrace the planned obsolescence and to get people to just buy the new one.
Okay, Paul and I we're gonna take a break in a moment, and we're gonna come back with a new episode on the 12 rules, because I don't want to overwhelm you. We've had a lot of information today, and we think it's the best course of action. But before we do the last part of today's show, I wanted to share a quote that I mentioned to Paul in a previous episode in the series on Paul Nunes. And it was about Steve Jobs, and Steve Jobs saying that Apple recognized trends, because Paul certainly recognizes trends. And it's one of the goals of his work is to help us understand laws like Moore's Law, Ehrum's Law, and a law we'll talk about later, Hike's Law. We'll tell you a little bit about that in the next episode. But get a load of this Steve Jobs excerpt from an interview that I found that I think is so important to understand.
Apple is a company that doesn't have the most resources of everybody in the world. And the way we've succeeded is by choosing what horses to ride really carefully, technically. We try to look for these technical vectors that have a future and that are headed up. And, technology, different pieces of technology kind of go in cycles. They have their springs and summers and autumns, and then they, go to the graveyard of technology. And so we try to pick things that are in their springs. And if you choose wisely, you can save yourself an enormous amount of work versus trying to do everything. And you can really put energy into making those new emerging technologies be great on your platform, rather than just okay because you're spreading yourself too thin.
I thought that quote in particular spoke volumes to your work. I'm actually pretty sure he read your book. So he talks about getting on the crest of those waves, understanding them, but also then a very important thing that's beyond the scope of today's chat, but is also how Apple, to avoid that idea of obsolescence and customers moving on to the next new thing, is locking them into the ecosystem or the family of Apple products and everything being interoperable. That's a really important aspect. But over to you for your comments on this, and then we'll wrap up today's episode.
Yeah, well, you can hardly find somebody better than Steve Jobs to sort of teach you about success in a technological world. And I think he says a couple of really interesting things. One is he mentions the platform, which was an important thing that for Apple over time that was really interesting. And then the fact that he talks about, and I love the term vector, because you're picking a vector and where are you and where things are sort of going. And so you think of, it was personal computing, but where did personal computing go? And one of the things that I think is really interesting is Apple's ability to move from, say, the iPod to the iPhone, recognizing that in iTunes and that the iPhone was going to destroy the iPod business. And, so that idea of being in on the spring of things and technological capability. I think the other thing that Apple points out and that Steve Jobs points out is the idea of, being at the new edge of capability, which really only goes to the nature of innovation, right? But it's like, well, of course you've got to be at the spring, because if you're not at the spring, if you're in the winter, if you're in the summer or the fall of a technology, it's not that innovative and not the place. So, but the thing of placing bets and not being everything to everybody, I think, is also really important. Apple's always sort of taken one category at a time and just knocked the heck out of it.
And supported by a great supply chain. For the supply chain nerds out there, you guys do a great job. So, but you know what? I thought I'd play that as well because it teases us up beautifully for the next episode, because that idea of spring, summer, autumn, winter also maps beautifully to your 4 phases of the shark fin as well. So we'll come back to that. And Paul, I have to say to our audience, you got to read Paul's series of books. They're so well written. They're so highly researched, so highly detailed, with so many new case studies and case studies of success as well. It's easy to point to all the failures in innovation the whole time, but there's great success stories in Paul's book as well. There's a copy there behind me, Big Bang Disruption. Highly recommend it. Still available in hard copy and on Kindle. And also behind me, don't forget, I have a copy of Jumping the S-Curve. I got 2 copies, and Paul kindly sent me a signed copy as well. So I'm going to give away my own copy to somebody out there as well. Just sign up to the Innovation Show Substack to be in with a chance to win that. It's always a huge pleasure. I learned so much from this man. Paul Nunes, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Aidan.